banging on the front door came so hard that Elena Whitfield nearly fell out of bed. It was well past midnight, and the sound of horses and men shouting carried through her window from the north field. She grabbed the nearest thing she could find, her robe, and rushed down the stairs without even glancing in a mirror. Her hair was loose and wild, tangled from sleep, and she did not care. Someone was on her land, and she intended to find out why. She threw open the door and ran across the wet grass barefoot, the cold air biting at her skin. Lanterns bobbed in the distance near the old oak trees that marked the boundary between her family's estate and the neighboring property. As she got closer, she saw men with axes, and two of the oldest trees on her land were already lying on the ground, their branches broken and scattered like bones. "Stop this at once," Elena shouted, her voice cutting through the night. The men froze, startled by the sight of a woman in a robe storming toward them with fire in her eyes. One of them dropped his axe entirely. A tall figure on horseback turned toward her. He wore a dark coat and sat with the kind of ease that comes from a lifetime of being obeyed. His face was mostly hidden in shadow, but she could tell he was studying her, unbothered by the chaos around them. "You are trespassing," Elena said, walking right up to his horse without a trace of fear. "These trees have stood on my family's land for over 100 years, and your men have destroyed 2 of them in a single night. I want an explanation, and I want it now." The man on the horse tilted his head slightly. "And who exactly are you to be giving orders at this hour, dressed like that?" Elena's cheeks burned, not from embarrassment, but from anger. "I am the owner of this land, sir, which is more than I can say, for whoever gave your men permission to cut down what does not belong to them." A low chuckle came from him, which only made her angrier. "These trees mark the border of Ravenscroft land. My surveyor confirmed it only yesterday." "Your surveyor is mistaken," Elena snapped. "My father had this boundary confirmed by the county 20 years ago. I have the documents to prove it, and I will not stand here while strangers destroy what took generations to grow." The man dismounted slowly, and even in the poor light, Elena could see he was younger than she expected, with sharp features and an unreadable expression. He walked toward her, unhurried, as if her anger amused him rather than concerned him. "You are quite bold for someone standing outside in her nightclothes," he said, his eyes flicking briefly over her disheveled appearance before returning to her face. "And you are quite reckless for someone destroying property that is not yours," she shot back. "I do not care who you are or how important you think you might be. Tomorrow morning, I will have the county records at your door, and you will pay for every tree your men cut down tonight." He raised an eyebrow, clearly not used to being spoken to this way. "Is that a threat?" "It is a promise," Elena said, crossing her arms. "Now get off my land before I call for the constable myself." For a moment, the man simply looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, though Elena could not read what it meant. He gave a short whistle, and his men immediately stopped their work, gathering their tools without another word. "You will hear from me again," he said quietly, swinging himself back onto his horse. "I look forward to it," Elena replied, refusing to back down even as he towered above her on the animal. "Perhaps next time, you will send someone with better manners." He said nothing more, only turned his horse and rode off into the darkness, with his men trailing behind him. Elena stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, watching until the last lantern disappeared over the hill. Only then did she notice how cold she was, her bare feet numb against the damp grass, her robe hanging loosely from the confrontation. She walked back toward the house slowly, her mind racing. She did not know who that man was, but something about him unsettled her in a way she could not quite explain. It was not fear. She was not afraid of him at all. It was something else, something she refused to examine too closely as she climbed the steps back into her home. Inside, her housekeeper, Margaret, was waiting by the door with a shawl in her hands, having woken from the noise outside. "Miss Whitfield, what happened? Are you hurt?" "I am fine, Margaret," Elena said, taking the shawl gratefully and wrapping it around her shoulders. "Someone was cutting down our trees along the north boundary. I chased them off, but I fear this is not the end of it." Margaret's face paled. "Do you know who it was?" "No," Elena admitted, sitting down at the kitchen table, suddenly exhausted. "But he spoke as though he owned the whole county. I have never seen such arrogance in my life." Margaret poured her a cup of warm tea and sat across from her. "You went out there dressed like that? In front of strange men?" Elena glanced down at her robe and felt a flicker of embarrassment for the first time since the encounter. "I did not have time to dress properly, Margaret. They were destroying our land. I was not about to worry about my appearance while that was happening." "Still," Margaret said gently, "a lady should be careful about how she presents herself, especially to men she does not know." "I do not care what impression I made," Elena said firmly, though a small part of her wondered exactly what the stranger had thought of her wild hair and her robe. She pushed the thought away. It did not matter what he thought. What mattered was protecting her father's land. The land he had worked so hard to keep after her mother passed. The land that was the only inheritance Elena had left in the world. She thought about her father often these days, especially at night, when the house felt too quiet and too large for just herself and Margaret. He had died 2 years ago, leaving Elena with debts, a crumbling estate, and a responsibility she never expected to carry alone. She had spent every day since fighting to keep the property from falling apart, negotiating with tenants, managing what little money remained, and refusing every suggestion that she should simply sell the land and move into the village. This was her home. She would not give it up without a fight, not to debt collectors, and certainly not to some arrogant man on a horse who thought he could take her trees in the middle of the night. The next morning, Elena rose early, despite having slept only a few hours. She dressed properly this time, in a simple green dress with her hair pinned neatly, and gathered the old documents her father had kept in a locked drawer in his study. The papers detailing the boundary agreement were exactly where she remembered, slightly yellowed with age but still legible. She packed them carefully into a leather satchel, determined to march straight to Ravenscroft Manor and demand answers from whoever was responsible for the damage. Margaret tried to convince her to send a letter instead, insisting it was not proper for a woman to arrive unannounced at a grand estate, especially one belonging to a family as prominent as the Ravenscrofts. But Elena would not be swayed. She had already lost sleep, 2 trees, and a good deal of patience. She was not going to waste another day, waiting for a polite response that might never come. The walk to Ravenscroft Manor took nearly an hour, though it felt shorter, with the anger fueling her steps. When the manor finally came into view, Elena slowed despite herself. She had heard stories about the estate, about its size and grandeur, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of it in person. The building rose from the hills like something out of a painting, with towering stone walls and rows of windows catching the morning light. It made her own home, once proud but now weathered by time and neglect, seem impossibly small in comparison. She squared her shoulders and continued up the long drive, refusing to be intimidated. A house was just a house, no matter how large. She had every right to be here, and she intended to make that clear. A servant met her at the door, looking surprised at the unannounced visitor. Elena explained, as calmly as she could manage, that she needed to speak with whoever was in charge of managing the estate's boundaries, regarding an incident that had occurred on her property the previous night. The servant hesitated, clearly unsure what to do with such a request, before finally asking her to wait in a small sitting room while he informed the household. Elena waited, tapping her foot against the polished floor, growing more impatient by the minute. She glanced around the room, taking in the fine furniture and the paintings on the walls, portraits of stern-looking men and women who she assumed were past members of the Ravenscroft family. One painting in particular caught her eye, a young man with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to follow her across the room. Something about his expression felt familiar, though she could not place why. The door opened, and Elena turned, expecting a steward or a land manager. Instead, she found herself face to face with the same man from the night before, now dressed in proper daytime clothes, his dark hair combed neatly, his expression composed and unreadable. Recognition hit her immediately, and so did a flush of embarrassment as she realized exactly whose land she had been standing on, and exactly who she had been shouting at while dressed in nothing but her night clothes. "You," she said, before she could stop herself. "Miss Whitfield, I presume," he said smoothly, as though their previous encounter had not involved raised voices and threats. "I apologize for not introducing myself properly last night. Circumstances did not allow for it." Elena felt her face grow warm, though she refused to let it show in her voice. "And who exactly are you, sir, that you feel entitled to destroy property that does not belong to you?" I am Alistair Ravenscroft, he said simply, watching her reaction carefully. Duke of Ravenscroft. The words hit Elena like a splash of cold water. A duke. She had shouted at a duke in the middle of the night, dressed in her robe, hair wild and undone, threatening him with the constable, as though he were some common thief. She had heard of the Duke of Ravenscroft, of course. Everyone in the county had, though she had never met him and knew almost nothing about him beyond his title and his reputation for keeping to himself. I see, she said finally, lifting her chin despite the heat still rising in her cheeks. Well, your grace, title or not, your men destroyed 2 trees that belonged to my family, and I intend to see that it does not happen again. To her surprise, the Duke did not seem offended by her continued boldness. If anything, there was a flicker of something like amusement in his eyes. You are remarkably unbothered by my rank, Miss Whitfield. Should I be? Elena asked. A wrong is a wrong, whether committed by a duke or a farmhand. I did not come here to bow and scrape, your grace. I came here for an explanation, and for assurance that this will not happen again. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Elena forced herself to hold his gaze, refusing to look away first. Finally, he gestured toward a chair. Please, sit. I believe we have some matters to discuss. Elena hesitated only briefly before taking the offered seat, setting her satchel of documents on her lap. The Duke sat across from her, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, watching her every movement as though trying to solve some kind of puzzle. My surveyor informed me that the boundary near the old oaks had shifted over the years, due to a stream that changed course, the Duke explained. He advised that the trees in question now stood on Ravenscroft land. I gave the order to clear them without personally verifying the claim. That was my mistake, and I take full responsibility for it. Elena blinked, caught off guard by the admission. She had expected excuses, perhaps even denial, not an outright acknowledgement of fault. You are admitting you were wrong? I am admitting my surveyor was wrong, and that I trusted his word without confirming it myself, the Duke said. If you have documentation proving the boundary as it stands, I would like to see it. Elena opened her satchel and pulled out the old papers, spreading them carefully across the small table between them. The Duke leaned forward, examining the faded ink and official seals with genuine interest, his brow furrowing slightly as he read through the details. These are legitimate, he said after a moment, glancing back up at her. This settles the matter. The trees on your land were wrongly cut, and I will see that you are compensated for the loss, along with any other damages caused by my men. Elena had prepared herself for an argument, for having to fight tooth and nail just to be heard, and instead, she found herself sitting across from a man who was calmly agreeing with everything she had come to say. It left her feeling strangely off balance, as though she had been ready for a battle that never came. Thank you, she said finally, gathering the papers back into her satchel. That is more than I expected. You expected me to argue with you, the Duke said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I expected you to dismiss me entirely, Elena admitted. Most men in your position would not have listened to a woman standing on their doorstep with old papers and a temper. Then perhaps most men in my position are fools, the Duke said simply, and something about the way he said it made Elena's stomach flutter unexpectedly. She pushed the feeling aside immediately, reminding herself that this man had nearly destroyed her family's land only hours before, and that a single apology did not erase that fact. I should return home, Elena said, rising from her seat. I have a great deal to attend to today. The Duke rose as well, walking her toward the door himself, rather than summoning a servant to do it. Miss Whitfield, he said as they reached the entrance, I hope you will allow me to send someone to properly assess the damage and arrange fair compensation. I take these matters seriously, despite how last night may have appeared. I would appreciate that, Elena said, and then, unable to help herself, added, though I hope in the future you will verify your surveyor's claims before sending men out at midnight to destroy someone's property. The Duke's mouth curved into something closer to a genuine smile this time. Duly noted, Miss Whitfield. I do not believe I have ever been so thoroughly scolded in my own home before. Then perhaps it was overdue, Elena said, and to her own surprise, she felt the corner of her own lips lifting slightly, before she caught herself, and smoothed her expression back into something more composed. She left the manor with her satchel in hand, and her mind spinning with a strange mixture of triumph and confusion. She had gone there expecting a fight, and instead had found something far more complicated. A man who did not fit the arrogant image she had built of him overnight. She told herself it did not matter, that this was simply a matter of property and nothing more. But as she walked back down the long drive toward home, she found herself thinking about the way he had looked at her, first in the dark of night, and then again in the light of day, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. By the time she reached her own front door, she had convinced herself that the strange fluttering in her chest was nothing more than lingering anger from the confrontation. She had no interest in dukes or their apologies. She had a home to protect and a life to rebuild, and she intended to focus on nothing else. But that evening, as she sat by the fire going over the estate's accounts, her mind kept drifting back to the sharp eyes that had studied her so intently across the small table, and to the voice that had called her remarkably unbothered, as though it were the highest compliment a man could give. She shook her head firmly and returned her attention to the numbers in front of her, determined to think of the Duke of Ravenscroft no more than absolutely necessary. She did not yet know that fate, and the Duke himself, had very different plans. A carriage arrived at Elena's home 3 days later, bearing the Ravenscroft crest on its door. Elena watched from her window as a well-dressed man stepped down, carrying a leather case, and approached her front entrance. She smoothed her dress and went to answer it herself, curious about what the Duke had sent this time. The man introduced himself as the Duke's land agent, sent to assess the damage from the incident and to arrange proper compensation. He walked the property with Elena for nearly 2 hours, taking notes and measurements, and by the end of the visit, he presented her with an offer that far exceeded what Elena had expected. Enough money to replace the trees, many times over, and enough to repair the fence along the northern edge that had been falling apart for years. His Grace was quite firm about ensuring you were satisfied, the agent said, as he prepared to leave. He asked that I convey his continued apologies for the disturbance. Elena thanked the man and watched the carriage disappear down the road, feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease. The compensation was generous, more than fair, and yet something about the whole situation continued to nag at her. Dukes did not usually concern themselves so thoroughly with the complaints of struggling landowners. There was no reason for him to have sent his agent personally, no reason for the offer to be so generous, unless he wanted something more from the arrangement than a simple resolution to a boundary dispute. She tried to put the thought out of her mind as the days passed, throwing herself back into the work of managing the estate. There were tenants to speak with about the coming harvest, repairs that needed attention before the colder months arrived, and the ever-present worry of stretching what little money she had as far as it could go. The compensation from the Duke helped ease some of that burden, but it did not erase the deeper problems that had plagued the estate since her father's passing. It was nearly a week after her visit to Ravenscroft Manor when Elena received an invitation, delivered by a servant on horseback, requesting her presence at a small gathering the Duke was hosting for a handful of local landowners to discuss matters concerning the county's roads and water rights. Elena stared at the invitation for a long moment, turning it over in her hands, as though the paper itself might explain why she, of all people, had been included among such company. She almost declined. She had little patience for social gatherings, especially ones filled with wealthy landowners who had never once offered her family assistance during the difficult years following her father's death. But curiosity, and perhaps something else she refused to name, convinced her to accept. The gathering was smaller than she expected, held in a comfortable drawing room rather than a grand ballroom, with perhaps a dozen guests seated around a large table covered in maps and documents. Elena arrived dressed carefully, her hair styled properly this time, determined not to give anyone reason to underestimate her. She was, after all, the only woman present managing an estate entirely on her own, and she intended to be taken seriously. The Duke greeted his guests with practiced ease, moving from conversation to conversation, with the kind of confidence that came naturally to someone who had spent his entire life in positions of authority. When his eyes landed on Elena, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of genuine pleasure that he seemed to quickly mask beneath a more neutral greeting. "Miss Whitfield," he said, approaching her directly, "I am pleased you decided to join us." "I was surprised to receive an invitation at all, Your Grace," Elena replied honestly. "I am not accustomed to being included in such gatherings. Your knowledge of this land runs deep, and your family has managed their estate for generations. the Duke said. It seemed foolish to discuss matters of water rights and road maintenance without your input. Elena studied him carefully, trying to determine whether his words were genuine or simply practiced charm meant to smooth over their rocky introduction. But there was something steady in the way he looked at her, something that made her believe, despite her better judgment, that he meant exactly what he said. The meeting itself proved surprisingly productive. Elena found herself speaking up more than once, correcting outdated assumptions about the flow of the local streams and pointing out issues with the current road maintenance schedule that none of the other landowners had considered. Several of the men around the table seemed startled by her knowledge, exchanging glances, as though unsure what to make of a woman contributing so confidently to matters typically left to men. But the Duke listened intently every time she spoke, nodding along and asking thoughtful questions that showed he was genuinely considering her perspective, rather than simply humoring her. By the time the meeting concluded, the other guests began filtering out, exchanging polite farewells before heading toward their carriages. Elena gathered her things, preparing to leave as well, when the Duke approached her once more. "Would you care to stay a moment longer?" he asked. "I would like to discuss something with you, if you have the time." Elena hesitated, glancing toward the door where the last of the guests were disappearing. "I suppose I have a few minutes." He led her out onto a stone terrace overlooking the estate's gardens, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across neatly trimmed hedges and blooming flower beds. The view was breathtaking, though Elena tried not to let it show on her face, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of knowing how impressed she was by his surroundings. "I wanted to thank you properly," the Duke said, standing beside her at the railing, "for your honesty that night, and for allowing me the chance to correct my mistake. Most people in your position would have taken the compensation and said nothing further, content to avoid any more dealings with me." "I am not most people," Elena said simply. "No," he agreed, a small smile forming. "I do not believe you are." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a pair of birds circle above the garden before settling into a nearby tree. Elena found herself relaxing slightly, the earlier tension of the gathering fading away in the quiet of the terrace. "May I ask you something, Miss Whitfield?" the Duke said finally. "You may ask," Elena replied. "I cannot promise I will answer." He chuckled softly at that. "Fair enough. I am curious how you came to manage your estate entirely on your own. It is unusual, to say the least, for a woman to take on such responsibility without a husband or brother to assist her." Elena's expression tightened slightly, though she forced herself to remain composed. "My father had no sons, only me. When he passed, there was no one else to take on the responsibility. I could have sold the land, moved into the village, and lived a quieter life, but I refused. That estate is the only piece of my family that remains, and I intend to keep it running for as long as I am able." "That is admirable," the Duke said, and there was no trace of mockery in his voice, only genuine respect. "Many would have taken the easier path." "The easier path is not always the right one," Elena said. "No," he agreed quietly, "it is not." Something in the way he said it made Elena glance up at him, curious about the shift in his tone. For a brief moment, his usually composed expression seemed to falter, revealing something more vulnerable beneath the surface, though he quickly recovered, straightening slightly as though catching himself. "You must think me strange, spending so much time discussing property disputes and estate management with a woman I only recently offended," he said, attempting to lighten the mood. "I think you are trying to make amends," Elena said. "Whether out of genuine guilt or simply a desire to protect your reputation, I have not yet decided." The Duke laughed, a real laugh this time, warm and unguarded. "You are remarkably direct, Miss Whitfield." "I have found directness serves me better than pretense," Elena replied, "especially when dealing with men who assume a woman cannot manage her own affairs." "I never assumed that," the Duke said, his expression sobering slightly. "Not after our first meeting, at least. Anyone who could stand before a duke in the middle of the night, hair in complete disarray, and demand justice without a hint of fear, is clearly capable of managing far more than a simple estate." Elena felt her cheeks warm at the mention of that night, remembering exactly how she must have looked, standing there in her robe with her hair wild and untamed. "I was not thinking of my appearance at the time. I was thinking only of my land." "I know," the Duke said softly. That is precisely what struck me most. The words hung in the air between them, and Elena found herself unsure how to respond, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. She glanced away, watching the birds in the garden, rather than meeting his gaze, uncertain what to make of the strange warmth spreading through her chest. "I should return home," she said finally. "It grows late, and I have much to attend to before evening." "Of course," the Duke said, though something in his voice suggested he was not entirely ready for their conversation to end. "Allow me to have a carriage take you back." "That is not necessary," Elena said quickly. "I am accustomed to walking." "I insist," the Duke said, and there was a firmness in his tone that told her arguing would be pointless. "It is the least I can offer, given everything that has passed between us." Elena relented, allowing him to escort her to the front of the manor where a carriage waited. As she climbed inside, she glanced back at him standing on the steps, his expression unreadable once more, though something in his eyes lingered on her longer than necessary. "Thank you for coming today, Miss Whitfield," he said. "I hope this will not be the last time we speak." "We shall see, Your Grace," Elena replied, though as the carriage pulled away and the manor disappeared from view, she found herself hoping, against her better judgment, that it would not be. The ride home gave her far too much time to think, and her thoughts kept circling back to the terrace, to the way he had spoken about her courage, to the flicker of vulnerability she had glimpsed beneath his composed exterior. She told herself repeatedly that it meant nothing, that a duke and a struggling landowner had no business entertaining thoughts beyond a polite, distant acquaintance, but the warmth in her chest refused to fade, no matter how firmly she tried to reason with herself. Over the following weeks, small gestures continued to arrive from Ravenscroft Manor, a crate of fine seeds for her spring planting, accompanied by a brief note wishing her a successful harvest. A skilled craftsman sent to repair a section of her roof that had been leaking for months, with instructions that the cost was already covered. Each gesture came without demand for anything in return, and each one chipped away further at the wall Elena had built around her heart since her father's passing. She began to notice things she had not allowed herself to notice before, the way her heart quickened whenever a messenger arrived from the manor, the way she found herself thinking about their conversation on the terrace at odd moments throughout the day, the way she caught herself wondering what he was doing, whether he thought of her as often as she now thought of him. It was during one such moment, standing in her garden with dirt on her hands and her thoughts far away at Ravenscroft Manor, that Margaret found her, smiling knowingly. "You have that look again, Miss Whitfield," Margaret said, setting down a basket of freshly picked vegetables. "What look?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The look of a woman thinking about someone she should not be thinking about," Margaret said with a small laugh. Elena opened her mouth to protest, to insist that nothing of the sort was happening, but the words would not come. Instead, she simply sighed, brushing the dirt from her hands as she considered the truth in Margaret's observation. "It is complicated," she admitted finally. "It always is," Margaret said gently, "when it involves matters of the heart." Elena said nothing further, but as she returned to her work, she could not deny the small, persistent hope that had begun to take root inside her, a hope she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Whatever was happening between herself and the Duke of Ravenscroft, she suspected it was only just beginning. The market square buzzed with activity on the morning Elena decided to sell some of her surplus produce alongside the other local farmers, hoping to earn a bit of extra money before the coming winter. She had barely set up her small stall when she heard her name being whispered among a cluster of women standing near the fabric merchant's cart. She pretended not to notice at first, arranging her baskets of vegetables with careful precision, but the whispers grew louder, laced with something sharper than simple curiosity. "That is the one woman murmured, not bothering to lower her voice enough. "The one who ran outside in her nightclothes to chase off the Duke's men." "I heard she confronted him herself, standing there with her hair a complete mess, shouting like a madwoman," another added, covering her mouth as she giggled. "And now he sends her gifts and invites her to his gatherings," the first woman said, her tone dripping with disdain. "One wonders what she did to earn such attention from a man of his standing." Elena's hands tightened around the basket she was holding, her jaw clenching as she forced herself to remain calm. She had known, of course, that word of the confrontation would spread eventually. Small towns thrived on gossip, and a story as scandalous as a woman shouting at a duke in her nightclothes was far too tempting for anyone to resist repeating. But hearing the whispers directly, twisted into something ugly and suggestive, stung far more than she had anticipated. She kept her eyes forward, focusing on arranging her stall, refusing to give the women the satisfaction of seeing how their words had affected her. A few other vendors nearby glanced her way with expressions of pity or curiosity, and Elena felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of anger and humiliation. She had done nothing wrong. She had defended her family's land against trespassers, and yet somehow, in the retelling, she had become the villain of the story, a woman scheming to trap a duke through impropriety. The whispers continued throughout the morning, following her like a shadow she could not shake. A young mother pulled her children slightly closer as she passed Elena's stall, casting a wary glance in her direction. An older gentleman, one of her father's former acquaintances, offered her only a stiff nod instead of his usual friendly greeting. By midday, Elena had sold barely half of what she normally would have. The whispers apparently enough to drive away customers who might otherwise have stopped to purchase her vegetables. She was beginning to pack up her stall early, unable to bear the weight of the stairs any longer, when a commotion near the square's entrance caught everyone's attention. A carriage bearing the unmistakable Ravenscroft crest rolled to a stop, and murmurs rippled through the crowd as the Duke himself stepped down, dressed impeccably as always, his presence immediately commanding attention. Elena froze, unsure whether to feel relief or dread at his sudden appearance. The last thing she wanted was for the gossip to grow even louder, fueled by the Duke's visit to the very market where she had just been the subject of ridicule. But instead of simply passing through, the Duke made his way directly toward her stall, ignoring the curious glances and hushed whispers that followed his every step. Elena straightened, trying to compose herself as he approached, though her heart was pounding with a mixture of nerves and something else she could not quite name. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice carrying easily across the square, loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "I had hoped to find you here. Your vegetables came highly recommended by my own kitchen staff, who purchased some last week, and could not stop praising the quality." Elena blinked, caught off guard by his words, unsure at first whether he was simply making polite conversation or attempting something else entirely. But the way his eyes held hers, steady and deliberate, told her he knew exactly what he was doing. "Thank you, Your Grace," she managed, finding her voice again. "I take great care in growing everything myself." "It shows," he said, picking up a basket of ripe tomatoes and examining them with genuine interest. "I would like to purchase a substantial amount, if you are willing. My kitchens could certainly use a reliable source, and I would rather support local growers than rely on merchants who bring produce from further afield." The crowd around them had grown noticeably quieter, many of the onlookers straining to hear the exchange, their earlier whispers replaced by stunned silence. Elena could see the same women who had been gossiping about her earlier, now watching with wide eyes, clearly unable to reconcile their earlier judgments with the sight of the Duke personally shopping at her humble stall. "Of course, Your Grace," Elena said, gathering herself enough to begin filling a larger basket with her best produce. "I would be honored to supply your kitchens." As she worked, the Duke remained beside her, engaging her in easy conversation about her farming methods, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. He complimented her knowledge of soil and seasons, and at one point, when a passing merchant made a snide comment just barely within earshot about the impropriety of the whole situation, the Duke turned toward the man with an expression that immediately silenced him. "I was under the impression this was a market for honest trade," the Duke said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Not a place for spreading unfounded gossip about a woman who has done nothing but defend her family's property with courage and dignity." The merchant stammered an apology and quickly busied himself with his own stall, refusing to meet the Duke's eyes. Elena felt a surge of gratitude mixed with something warmer, something that made her chest tighten as she watched him defend her so openly, without hesitation or concern for how it might appear. "You did not need to do that," Elena said quietly, once the crowd had begun to disperse and return to their own business. "I disagree," the Duke said, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "You defended what was rightfully yours, with more courage than most men I know possess. The idea that people would twist that into something shameful is an injustice I could not simply ignore. People will talk regardless, Elena said. Nothing you say will stop them entirely. Perhaps not, the Duke admitted. But perhaps it will make them think twice before repeating such nonsense so carelessly. Elena finished filling the basket and handed it to one of his waiting servants, who carried it toward the carriage. The Duke lingered a moment longer, seemingly reluctant to leave despite the curious eyes still watching from a distance. I hope this experience has not discouraged you from continuing to sell here, he said. Your produce is genuinely excellent, and I meant what I said about wanting a reliable source for my kitchens. I will continue, Elena said firmly. I refuse to let gossip chase me away from something I have every right to do. The Duke smiled at that, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and made something flutter in Elena's chest, despite her best efforts to remain composed. I suspected as much. You are not the type to be easily discouraged, Miss Whitfield. No, she agreed. I am not. He bid her farewell shortly after, climbing back into his carriage as the crowd watched with renewed interest, though the tone of their whispers had shifted noticeably from mockery to something closer to astonishment and grudging respect. Elena finished packing up her remaining goods, her mind spinning with everything that had just occurred. She walked home that evening with a lighter heart than she had carried in weeks, despite the earlier humiliation of the morning's gossip. The Duke's public defense had done more than simply silence her critics. It had shown her, more clearly than any private conversation could have, that his interest in her was not fleeting, or born purely out of guilt for their initial encounter. He had stood beside her, publicly and without hesitation, in a way that suggested he genuinely cared about how she was treated. That night, as she sat by her fire reviewing the day's earnings, boosted considerably by the Duke's generous purchase, Margaret joined her with a knowing look on her face. Word has already reached the kitchen about what happened at the market today, Margaret said, settling into the chair across from Elena. They say the Duke defended you in front of half the village. He did, Elena said, unable to fully suppress the small smile tugging at her lips. And what do you make of that? Margaret asked gently. Elena considered the question carefully before answering. I do not know what to make of it entirely. I only know that it felt different than anything I have experienced before. He did not have to defend me. He gained nothing from it, only more gossip and speculation about his own reasons for doing so. Perhaps his reasons are simpler than you think, Margaret said with a small smile of her own. Elena did not respond immediately, her thoughts drifting back to the terrace at Ravenscroft Manor, to the way he had spoken about her courage, to the steady warmth in his eyes as he stood beside her at the market that very day. She was beginning to suspect, despite every effort to convince herself otherwise, that Margaret's simple explanation might be closer to the truth than she was ready to admit. The following days brought no further gestures from the manor, no invitations or unexpected visits, and Elena found herself surprised by how much she missed the small moments of connection that had become, in such a short time, an unexpected comfort in her otherwise solitary life. She busied herself with the estate's autumn preparations, telling herself repeatedly that whatever had begun between them, whether friendship or something more, would unfold in its own time, without her constant worrying pushing it forward. But as the leaves began to turn, and the air grew crisper with the approaching change of season, Elena could not shake the feeling that something significant was shifting, not just within the walls of Ravenscroft Manor, but within her own carefully guarded heart as well. Autumn settled over the county, with cool mornings and golden fields, and Elena found herself busier than ever, preparing her estate for the coming winter. It was during one of these long working days, while she was mending a section of fence near the eastern edge of her property, that she heard the sound of hooves approaching along the path that connected her land to the road. She looked up, expecting perhaps a tenant or a merchant delivering supplies, and instead found the Duke himself riding toward her, dressed simply for once, without the formal coats and polished boots she had grown accustomed to seeing him in. He dismounted a short distance away and approached on foot, his expression softer and more relaxed than she had seen it before. Your Grace, Elena said, straightening from her work and wiping her hands on her apron. This is an unexpected visit. I hope not an unwelcome one, he replied, glancing at the fence she had been repairing. I was riding through the area and thought I might check on the condition of the boundary, given our history with it. Elena raised an eyebrow, unconvinced by his explanation. The boundary near the oaks is on the northern side of my property, Your Grace. This fence is nowhere near there. A faint flush colored his cheeks. and for the first time since she had known him, the composed Duke of Ravenscroft appeared genuinely flustered. "You have caught me, Miss Whitfield. I confess I simply wished to see you," and the boundary excuse seemed a reasonable one at the time. Elena could not help the small laugh that escaped her at his admission. "You could have simply said so, Your Grace. I would not have thought less of you for it." "Perhaps I was not entirely certain how such an admission would be received," he said, some of his composure returning, as he studied her reaction carefully. "You are welcome here," Elena said simply, excuse or not. He seemed to relax at that, and together they walked along the fence line, Elena continuing her repairs while the Duke, to her surprise, rolled up his sleeves and began helping her secure the loose boards without being asked. She watched him work for a moment, genuinely startled by the sight of a Duke engaged in manual labor, his hands growing dusty as he held boards steady for her to nail into place. "You do not need to do this," she said, though she made no move to stop him. "I have spent far too much of my life sitting behind a desk, reviewing ledgers, and settling disputes between tenants," he said, testing the stability of a newly repaired section. "There is something satisfying about working with one's hands, about seeing immediate results from honest effort." They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic tapping of the hammer and the distant calls of birds preparing for the changing season. Elena found herself stealing glances at him occasionally, noticing the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he seemed genuinely engaged in the simple task rather than merely humoring her. "May I ask you something?" Elena said eventually, breaking the comfortable quiet between them. "Of course," the Duke replied, setting down the hammer to look at her fully. "Why does a man of your position concern himself so much with the affairs of a struggling landowner?" she asked. "You have far more important matters to attend to than helping repair fences or purchasing vegetables at the local market." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "I suppose the honest answer is that I have grown tired of the world I was born into," he said finally. "Everyone around me speaks carefully, calculates every word for its political value, and treats every interaction as an opportunity for advancement. You have never once spoken to me that way. From the very first night we met, you have been nothing but honest, even when that honesty came at a cost to yourself." Elena considered his words, understanding more than she expected to about the isolation that must come with his position. "It cannot be easy, living surrounded by people who only tell you what they think you want to hear." "It is lonelier than most would imagine," the Duke admitted, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable than she had heard it before. "My mother passed when I was young, and my father, though a good man, was consumed by his duties and rarely present in my life. I was engaged once, to a woman my father believed would strengthen our family's political standing. She left me for another man with a larger title before the wedding could even take place." Elena's chest tightened at the raw honesty in his voice, understanding now the guarded quality she had sensed in him from their very first encounter. "I am sorry," she said softly. "That must have been difficult." "It taught me a valuable lesson about the nature of the world I live in," he said, a bitter edge creeping into his tone before he forced it away. "But it also made me wary of trusting anyone's intentions toward me. Which is why, I suppose, your fearlessness that first night struck me so profoundly. You had no idea who I was. You spoke to me as you would speak to anyone trespassing on your land, without concern for my title or my wealth. It was the first genuine interaction I had experienced in longer than I care to admit." Elena felt a warmth spreading through her chest at his words, understanding now the depth of what had drawn him toward her in the weeks since their first meeting. "I did not know who you were," she said, "but even if I had, I do not believe it would have changed how I spoke to you that night. A wrong is a wrong, regardless of title." "I know," the Duke said, a small smile returning to his face. "That is precisely why I have found myself thinking of you far more often than I probably should, Miss Whitfield." The admission hung in the air between them, and Elena felt her heart quicken at the sincerity in his voice. She had suspected, of course, that his frequent visits and generous gestures meant something more than simple courtesy, but hearing him say it so plainly left her both thrilled and uncertain how to respond. "I have found myself thinking of you as well, Your Grace," she admitted finally, the words feeling both terrifying and freeing as she spoke them aloud. Something shifted in his expression at her confession, a warmth spreading across his features that transformed his usually composed demeanor into something far more open and genuine. "I am glad to hear it," he said softly. "I confess, I have not been entirely certain how to proceed, given the differences in our circumstances." "Our circumstances need not dictate everything," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she understood the complications that lay ahead. Society would not easily accept a duke pursuing a woman of her modest standing, regardless of how genuine their connection might be. "No," the duke agreed, "they need not, though I imagine there will be those who disagree." "There always are," Elena said with a small shrug, though the reality of what he was suggesting settled heavily in her chest. "Are you prepared for that, Your Grace? For the whispers and the judgment that would surely follow?" The duke considered the question seriously before answering. "I have spent my entire life following the expectations others placed upon me, marrying for advantage, socializing with people who cared nothing for genuine connection. I find I am rather tired of living that way. If pursuing something real means facing judgment from people whose opinions I have never truly respected, then I believe I am prepared to face it." Elena studied his face, searching for any sign of hesitation or doubt, but found only steady conviction in his expression. Whatever fears she carried about the difficulties that lay ahead, she could not deny the genuine warmth blooming in her chest at his words. "Then perhaps we should continue this conversation over dinner sometime," Elena said, surprising herself with her own boldness, rather than fence repairs and boundary disputes. The Duke laughed, a full and genuine sound that seemed to lighten the entire atmosphere between them. "I would like that very much, Miss Whitfield." They finished the remaining sections of fence together, as the afternoon light began to soften, and when the Duke finally prepared to leave, he lingered a moment longer than necessary, beside his horse, looking back at her, with an expression that made her heart race. "Until dinner, then," he said. "Until dinner," Elena agreed, watching as he mounted his horse and rode off down the path, her heart lighter than it had been in longer than she could remember. She returned to her house that evening with a smile she could not quite suppress, and when Margaret asked about her day, Elena simply shook her head and said that some things were still too new and fragile to speak of just yet. But privately, as she prepared for bed that night, she allowed herself to imagine, for the first time in years, a future that included more than simply surviving and protecting what remained of her father's legacy. She allowed herself to imagine happiness, genuine and unexpected, blooming in a place she had never thought to look for it. The dinner Elena had suggested took place a week later, not at the grand halls of Ravenscroft Manor, but at a small, quiet inn along the river that the Duke insisted served the finest roasted duck in the entire county. Elena had been skeptical at first, expecting perhaps a private room reserved specifically for his use, but instead they sat at a modest table near the window, much like any other couple enjoying an evening meal together. "I thought you might prefer somewhere less formal," the Duke explained as they settled into their seats. "Ravenscroft Manor tends to make guests feel as though they are being judged by every portrait on the wall." Elena laughed, appreciating the thoughtfulness behind his choice. "This is perfect, Your Grace. Though I admit, I am still adjusting to the idea of sharing a meal with a duke in such simple surroundings." "Please, call me Alistair," he said, his tone gentle but earnest. "At least when we are away from prying ears. I find I would rather hear my own name from you than my title." "Alistair," Elena repeated, testing the sound of it. "Very well. And you may call me Elena, if you wish." "Elena," he said softly, as though savoring the word, and something in the way he said it sent a warm shiver down her spine. Their conversation flowed easily throughout the meal, moving from light-hearted topics like favorite books and childhood memories, to deeper discussions about their hopes for the future. Elena found herself opening up more than she had with anyone since her father's passing, sharing stories about her childhood on the estate, about the lessons her father had taught her regarding patience and perseverance, about the quiet grief that still lingered whenever she walked past his empty study. In turn, Alistair spoke more freely than she had yet heard him, describing the pressures of his position, the weight of managing not just his own estate, but the responsibilities that came with his title, affecting the lives of countless tenants and workers who depended on his decisions. He spoke of his father's declining health in his final years, of the isolation he had felt inheriting such enormous responsibility while still grieving. of the careful walls he had built around himself afterward to avoid being hurt again, as he had been by his broken engagement. I never expected to find someone who understood that particular kind of loneliness, Alistair admitted, as their meal drew to a close, the candlelight flickering softly between them, being surrounded by people, yet feeling as though no one truly sees you. I understand it well, Elena said quietly. Since my father passed, I have felt invisible in many ways, simply expected to manage and survive without anyone truly asking how I am faring beneath the surface. I see you, Alistair said, his voice low and sincere, his eyes holding hers steadily across the small table. I have seen you since that very first night, Elena, standing in the moonlight with more courage than most people manage in an entire lifetime. Elena felt her breath catch at the intensity in his words, at the genuine warmth radiating from his gaze. As she reached across the table, without quite deciding to do so, and he met her halfway, his hand closing gently around hers. I am frightened, Elena admitted softly, of what this might mean, of how complicated it could become. I am frightened as well, Alistair said, surprising her with his honesty. But I find that fear pales in comparison to how I feel when I am with you. I have not felt this way in longer than I care to admit, Elena. I do not intend to let fear stand in the way of something I believe could be extraordinary. They sat together for a long while after that, simply talking, their hands remaining joined across the table as the evening deepened around them. When it finally came time to leave, Alistair insisted on escorting her home personally, and the carriage ride passed in comfortable conversation, punctuated by moments of quiet contentment that Elena had not experienced in years. As the carriage pulled up to her home, Alistair helped her down and walked her to the door, lingering a moment longer than necessary in the cool evening air. Thank you for this evening, Elena said softly. It has been a very long time since I felt this genuinely happy. The pleasure was entirely mine, Alistair replied, his eyes warm in the moonlight. I hope this is only the beginning of many more evenings together. I hope so too, Elena said, and before she could second-guess herself, she rose slightly on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. Alistair's expression softened immediately, a genuine smile spreading across his features that made him look years younger than his usual composed demeanor allowed. Good night, Elena, he said softly. Good night, Alistair, she replied, watching as he returned to his carriage, glancing back at her once more before it pulled away into the darkness. Elena entered her home with her heart full and her mind spinning with possibility. She found Margaret waiting up for her, as she often did, and the older woman took one look at Elena's flushed cheeks and bright eyes before breaking into a knowing smile. I take it the evening went well, Margaret said. Better than well, Elena admitted, sinking into a chair by the fire, still glowing with happiness. I have not felt this way in years, Margaret. It frightens me almost as much as it excites me. Love often does, Margaret said gently, settling into the chair across from her. But that fear should not stop you from embracing something that could bring you genuine happiness, Miss Whitfield. You have spent so long carrying burdens alone. Perhaps it is time to allow someone to share that weight with you. Elena considered Margaret's words carefully, understanding the wisdom in them even as uncertainty continued to linger at the edges of her joy. She knew, better than most, how quickly society could turn against those who dared to step outside expected boundaries. A duke, pursuing a woman of her modest standing, would draw attention, scrutiny, and likely no small amount of malice from those who believed such matches were beneath their station. But as she climbed into bed that night, her thoughts still lingering on the warmth in Alistair's eyes and the gentle sincerity in his voice, Elena found it increasingly difficult to focus on the potential difficulties ahead. For the first time since her father's passing, she allowed herself simply to feel happy, without immediately searching for the complications that might follow. In the weeks that followed, their courtship continued to deepen, though they remained careful about how openly they conducted themselves in public, both aware of the scrutiny that would inevitably arise once word spread more widely. They met for quiet walks along the river, shared meals at the small inn that had become something of a private refuge for them, and exchanged letters filled with growing affection whenever circumstances prevented them from meeting in person. Elena found herself falling deeper into genuine love with each passing day, discovering layers of Alistair's character that continued to surprise and delight her. Beneath his composed ducal exterior, She found a man who was thoughtful, occasionally self-deprecating, and possessed of a dry sense of humor that often caught her off guard into unexpected laughter. He, in turn, seemed equally captivated by her, often commenting on how she made him feel more like himself than he had in years, free from the constant performance his position typically demanded. But even as their happiness grew, Elena could not entirely shake the awareness that their relationship existed in a delicate, protected bubble, one that would inevitably burst once society at large became fully aware of its existence. She tried not to dwell on the potential consequences, choosing instead to savor each moment of genuine connection as it came, but a small part of her remained braced for the challenges she knew were surely still ahead. The frost had begun to touch the grass by the time Alistair suggested Elena visit Ravenscroft Manor properly, not for a formal gathering or a boundary dispute, but simply to spend an afternoon together, away from the watchful eyes of the village. Elena arrived to find him waiting near the entrance, dressed casually, a warm smile spreading across his face the moment he saw her. "I thought we might walk through the eastern gardens," he said, offering his arm. "They are less impressive this time of year, but there is a particular spot I believe you would enjoy." They walked together through the grounds, the cold air crisp against their cheeks, fallen leaves crunching beneath their feet. Alistair led her toward a small clearing surrounded by tall hedges, where a stone bench sat beneath the bare branches of an old willow tree, overlooking a quiet pond that reflected the pale afternoon sky.
"This was my mother's favorite place on the entire estate," Alistair explained as they settled onto the bench together.
"She used to bring me here when I was young, before she passed. I have not shared this spot with anyone since." Elena felt the weight of the gesture, understanding the significance of him choosing to bring her somewhere so deeply personal. "Thank you for sharing it with me now," she said softly. "I find myself wanting to share a great deal with you these days," Alistair admitted, turning to face her more fully. "Things I have kept guarded for years, thoughts I never expected to voice aloud to anyone." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the gentle ripples across the pond's surface, before Alistair spoke again, his voice quieter and more hesitant than she had heard it before. "My engagement, before Celeste left me, was arranged when I was barely 20 years old," he said. "My father believed the match would strengthen our family's political standing, and I, being young and eager to please him, agreed without much thought to my own feelings on the matter. I convinced myself over time that I cared for her, though looking back, I believe I simply wanted to feel less alone." "What happened?" Elena asked gently, sensing there was more to the story than he had shared before. "She grew close to another man, one with a title greater than mine at the time, and left barely a month before our wedding was to take place," Alistair said, his voice carrying old pain despite the years that had passed. "The humiliation was significant, of course, but what wounded me more deeply was realizing how little she had actually cared for me as a person. I had simply been a means to an end for her, a stepping stone towards something better that eventually presented itself." Elena reached for his hand, offering silent comfort as he continued. "After that, I convinced myself that genuine affection was simply not something available to someone in my position," he continued. "Everyone I met seemed to want something from me, whether wealth, status, or influence. I stopped believing that anyone could care for me simply for who I was, rather than what I could offer them." "And now?" Elena asked softly. Alistair turned to look at her fully, his expression open and vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache with tenderness. "Now I find myself questioning everything I believed about love and connection. You have never once asked me for anything, Elena. You confronted me that first night with nothing but righteous anger over your family's land, with no knowledge of my title or wealth. Every moment since has only confirmed what I suspected from the very beginning, that your affection, if I am fortunate enough to have earned it, is entirely genuine." "It is," Elena said without hesitation. "I care for you, Alistair, not for your title or your estate, but for the man who helps repair fences and defends strangers at the market and shares his mother's favorite spot with someone he has only known a short while." Alistair's eyes softened further, and he lifted her hand gently to press a soft kiss against her knuckles. "I have not felt this way about anyone in a very long time, Elena. I find myself hoping for a future I had long since given up believing was possible for me." "What kind of future?" Elena asked, her heart pounding as she anticipated his answer. A future where I am not simply a duke fulfilling obligations, but a man building a genuine life alongside someone who understands and accepts me completely, Alistair said. A future that includes you, if you would have me. Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity and vulnerability in his words. I would have you, Alistair. Title, obligations, and all the complications that come with them. He smiled then, a genuine and unguarded expression that transformed his entire face, and he leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. She did not. Their lips met gently, a soft and tender kiss that spoke of genuine affection rather than mere passion, and Elena felt something inside her, some long-guarded piece of her heart, finally settle into place. When they finally parted, Alistair rested his forehead gently against hers, both of them smiling softly in the quiet afternoon light. I have wanted to do that since the very first night we met, he admitted with a small laugh, even as you were threatening to call the constable on me. Elena laughed as well, the sound light and genuine. I confess I have thought about it more than once myself, particularly during our conversation on your terrace. Then it seems we have both been rather patient, Alistair said, brushing a strand of hair gently away from her face. They remained in the garden for the rest of the afternoon, talking softly about their hopes for the future, about the challenges they might face, about the slow, careful process of introducing their relationship more openly to the world around them. Alistair spoke of wanting to formally court her, to eventually present her properly to society as someone he intended to marry, though both understood the difficulties such an announcement would bring. There will be those who object, Alistair said seriously, as the afternoon light began to fade. Members of the aristocracy who believe such matches diminish the family's standing, who will spread cruel rumors and attempt to undermine what we have built together. I am prepared for that, Elena said, though a flicker of worry crossed her mind at the thought. I will protect you from as much of it as I am able, Alistair promised, his tone firm and determined. But I cannot promise it will be easy. There is one person in particular I worry about, Lady Celeste, my former fiancée. She has recently returned to the county, and I have heard whispers that she regrets her earlier decision, now that my position has only grown more secure over the years. Elena felt a small knot of unease form in her stomach at the mention of the woman who had once broken his heart. Do you believe she intends to interfere? I do not know, Alistair admitted honestly, but I want you to be prepared, regardless of what may come. My feelings for you are genuine and unwavering, Elena. Nothing Celeste says or does will change that. Elena nodded, appreciating his honesty, even as the mention of a potential rival settled uncomfortably in her chest. She trusted Alistair's feelings, trusted the genuine connection they had built together over the past weeks, but she also understood, better than most, how quickly circumstances could shift when powerful people with their own agendas became involved. As the sun began to set behind the manor's towering walls, Alistair walked her back toward the entrance, their hands intertwined, both reluctant to end the peaceful afternoon they had shared. Before she departed, he pulled her close one final time, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Whatever challenges lie ahead, we will face them together, he said softly. I promise you that, Elena. Together, Elena repeated, holding on to the word like a promise, as she climbed into the carriage that would carry her home, her heart full of hope, despite the uncertainty that lingered at the edges of her happiness. She did not yet know how soon that uncertainty would demand to be faced, or how deeply Lady Celeste's return would test the foundation they had so carefully built together. Lady Celeste Ashworth arrived in the county, with the kind of quiet fanfare that only the truly wealthy could command, her carriage trimmed in gold, her reputation preceding her by several days. Elena first heard of her return through Margaret, who had gathered the news while purchasing supplies in the village, and something in the older woman's careful tone told Elena immediately that this was not simply idle gossip. They say she has come back specifically because of the Duke, Margaret said, setting down a basket of flour on the kitchen table. Word has it, her marriage ended poorly, and she has set her sights on renewing old connections. Elena felt her stomach tighten at the news, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. Alistair mentioned she might return. He assured me his feelings for her ended long ago. Feelings can be complicated things, Margaret said gently, not unkindly, but with the caution of someone who had seen enough of the world to understand its unpredictability. especially when old wounds are involved. Elena tried to push aside her worry over the following days, trusting in the sincerity Alistair had shown her, in the countless small gestures and honest conversations that had built the foundation of their relationship. But the unease lingered nonetheless, growing sharper when she received word that Lady Celeste had been seen at several social gatherings, always managing to place herself near wherever Alistair happened to be in attendance. The first direct encounter came at a harvest gathering hosted by one of the county's more prominent families, an event Elena attended at Alistair's insistence, despite her earlier reluctance about appearing publicly alongside him before matters had been properly settled. The evening had been pleasant enough at first, filled with music and light-hearted conversation, until Elena noticed a striking woman in an elegant gown making her way directly toward where she and Alistair stood near the refreshment table. "Alistair, darling," the woman said, her voice smooth and practiced, entirely too familiar for someone who had left him standing at an altar years before. "It has been far too long." "Celeste," Alistair said, his tone carefully polite but noticeably cool. "I was not aware you had returned to the area." "I thought it was time," Celeste said, her eyes sweeping over Elena with an assessment that felt far too thorough, far too calculating. "And who is this lovely companion of yours?" "This is Miss Elena Whitfield," Alistair said, his hand finding Elena's protectively. "A dear friend of mine." Celeste's smile widened slightly, though it did not reach her eyes. "How wonderful. I have heard the most fascinating stories about a Miss Whitfield, something involving a rather scandalous midnight encounter in her nightclothes, if I recall correctly." Elena felt her cheeks flush, the old humiliation resurfacing despite the months that had passed since that first confrontation. "I was defending my family's property, Lady Celeste, nothing more." "Of course," Celeste said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "Though I imagine such stories do tend to follow a person, regardless of the true circumstances behind them." "Celeste," Alistair said, his voice sharper now, "perhaps we should discuss something else." "Certainly," Celeste said smoothly, though her eyes remained fixed on Elena with an intensity that made her distinctly uncomfortable. "I merely wish to become acquainted with the woman who has apparently captured so much of your attention lately, Alistair. It seems all anyone speaks of these days is the Duke's new companion." The conversation continued for a few more strained moments before Celeste finally excused herself, drifting away to speak with other guests, though Elena noticed her glancing back more than once throughout the remainder of the evening, her expression unreadable, but her attention clearly still fixed on their interactions. "I apologize for that," Alistair said quietly, once Celeste had moved out of earshot. "She has always had a talent for making people uncomfortable when it suits her purposes." "What does she want, Alistair?" Elena asked, unable to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled over her since Celeste's approach. "I do not know," Alistair admitted, his brow furrowed with concern. "But I intend to make certain she understands that whatever regrets she may have about our past are entirely her own to bear. My future lies with you, Elena, not with rekindling something that ended long ago." Elena wanted to believe his reassurances completely, and she did trust his sincerity, but something about the calculating look in Celeste's eyes left a lingering unease that refused to fully dissipate, even as the evening continued, and Alistair remained attentive and affectionate by her side. Over the following weeks, Celeste's presence seemed to multiply throughout the county, appearing at gatherings Elena had not expected her to attend, always managing to insert herself into conversations, always watching with that same calculating expression. Rumors began circulating once more, though this time they carried a different edge, whispers suggesting that Elena had somehow trapped the Duke through scheming, that she was merely using him to escape her family's declining fortunes. Elena tried her best to ignore the growing gossip, focusing instead on the genuine happiness she found in her relationship with Alistair. But the constant undercurrent of tension began to wear on her nonetheless. She noticed small changes in how people treated her around the village, a coolness from those who had once been friendly, sidelong glances from women who had previously offered nothing but polite indifference. It was during a quiet evening at Ravenscroft Manor, sharing tea in the small sitting room they had come to favor for their private conversations, that Elena finally voiced the concerns that had been building within her. "I worry that my presence in your life is causing more harm than good," she admitted, staring down at her cup rather than meeting his eyes. The rumors have grown worse since Celeste's return, and I cannot help but wonder if things would be simpler for you without the complications I bring." Alistair set down his own cup immediately, reaching for her hands with an expression of genuine alarm. "Elena, please do not speak that way. You bring nothing but genuine happiness into my life. Whatever complications exist are the result of small-minded gossip, not anything you have done wrong." "But the rumors," Elena continued, unable to fully quiet the doubts swirling within her. "They say I am scheming, that I trapped you somehow. What if such rumors damage your standing, your ability to lead your estate effectively?" "Let them talk," Alistair said firmly, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. "I have spent my entire life allowing others' opinions to dictate my choices, and it brought me nothing but loneliness and heartbreak. I refuse to make that mistake again, Elena. I love you, genuinely and completely, and no amount of gossip or scheming from Celeste or anyone else will change that." The admission of love, spoken so plainly and with such conviction, took Elena's breath away. "You love me?" she asked softly, needing to hear the words confirmed once more. "I have loved you for weeks now," Alistair said, his expression softening as he looked at her. "Perhaps longer than I have been willing to admit even to myself. I intended to wait until circumstances were more settled to tell you so plainly, but I find I can no longer keep such feelings hidden." "I love you as well," Elena said, tears gathering in her eyes, as relief and joy overwhelmed the lingering worry that had plagued her for weeks. "I have loved you since that afternoon in the garden, perhaps even before then." Alistair pulled her into a gentle embrace, and Elena allowed herself to sink into the comfort of his arms, momentarily setting aside the concerns about Celeste and the gossip that continued to swirl around them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she reminded herself, they would face them together, exactly as he had promised. But even as she allowed herself this moment of peace, a small part of her remained wary, aware that Celeste's return had brought with it a complication that would not easily resolve itself without confrontation. She did not yet know how soon that confrontation would arrive, or how deeply it would test the love she and Alistair had so carefully built together. Alistair announced his intention to host a grand ball at Ravenscroft Manor, the first such event since his father's passing years before, and word quickly spread that he intended to use the occasion to make a significant announcement. Elena suspected, with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, exactly what that announcement might entail, though Alistair had remained playfully secretive about his exact plans whenever she pressed him for details. "You will simply have to wait and see," he told her with a knowing smile, during one of their private walks through the estate's gardens, now beginning to show early signs of the coming spring. "Though I promise, it will be an evening you remember for the rest of your life." Elena spent the days leading up to the ball in a state of nervous anticipation, having a new gown commissioned specifically for the occasion, a deep blue fabric that Margaret insisted brought out the color of her eyes beautifully. She practiced her posture and her manners, determined not to give anyone reason to doubt her ability to hold herself with grace and dignity, regardless of her modest upbringing, compared to the aristocratic guests, who would surely fill the manor's grand ballroom. The evening of the ball arrived with a flurry of activity, and Elena found herself nervous in a way she had not experienced since that very first confrontation with Alistair months before. She arrived at Ravenscroft Manor to find it transformed, every window glowing with candlelight, music drifting from the ballroom as carriages lined the long drive, delivering guests dressed in their finest attire. Alistair met her at the entrance, his eyes widening with genuine admiration as he took in her appearance. "You look absolutely radiant, Elena," he said softly, pressing a gentle kiss to her gloved hand. "Thank you," Elena said, her nervousness easing slightly under the warmth of his gaze. "You look rather handsome yourself, Your Grace." He laughed softly at her teasing use of his title, offering his arm to escort her into the ballroom, where the assembled guests turned to observe their entrance with varying expressions of curiosity, interest, and in some cases, thinly veiled disapproval. Elena held her head high, refusing to let their judgment diminish the happiness she felt at Alistair's side. The evening progressed pleasantly at first, filled with dancing and conversation, and Elena found herself relaxing gradually as she moved through the crowd alongside Alistair, who remained attentive and affectionate despite the watchful eyes surrounding them throughout the ballroom. Several guests, surprisingly, greeted her with genuine warmth, having heard of her courage during the initial confrontation and her subsequent kindness at the local market, stories that had apparently traveled further than the crueler gossip Elena had feared. But as the evening wore on, Elena noticed Celeste circulating through the crowd with a calculating expression that unsettled her, engaging various guests in whispered conversations that ceased abruptly whenever Elena drew near enough to overhear. She tried to push aside her growing unease, focusing instead on the joy of the evening, on the way Alistair's eyes softened whenever he looked at her, on the anticipation building within her about whatever announcement he had planned. It was during a brief pause between dances, while Elena stood near the edge of the ballroom catching her breath, that Celeste approached her directly for the first time that evening, her expression deceptively pleasant. "You seem to be enjoying yourself immensely, Miss Whitfield," Celeste said, her voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of several nearby guests. "Though I confess I find myself curious about your sudden rise in society. It cannot be easy, adjusting to such elevated company when one's own circumstances remain so modest." "I manage well enough," Elena replied evenly, refusing to let the barb affect her outward composure, though her stomach tightened with growing apprehension. "I am certain you do," Celeste said, her smile sharpening slightly. "Though I do wonder, does Alistair know about the substantial debts your family still carries? I understand the estate has been on the verge of ruin for quite some time now, long before this rather convenient romance began." Elena felt her blood run cold, the accusation landing with precise cruelty, despite its lack of complete accuracy. "My family's finances are none of your concern, Lady Celeste." "Perhaps not," Celeste said, her voice carrying further now, drawing more attention from the surrounding guests. "But I imagine they would be of considerable concern to Alistair, were he to learn that his affections have been so conveniently directed towards someone in such desperate need of financial rescue. One does wonder whether your feelings for him are entirely genuine, or whether they conveniently align with your family's dire circumstances." The words struck Elena like a physical blow, and she noticed, with growing horror, that several guests nearby had turned to listen, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something closer to suspicion. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but found the words caught in her throat, overwhelmed by the public nature of the accusation and the doubt she could see forming in the eyes around her. "That is a baseless and cruel accusation," Elena finally managed, though her voice trembled slightly, despite her efforts to remain composed. "Is it?" Celeste asked, feigning innocent surprise. "I merely repeat what half the county has already been whispering for weeks, Miss Whitfield. Surely you cannot be surprised that people question the timing of your sudden romance with a duke, given your family's well-known financial struggles." Murmurs began rippling through the surrounding guests, and Elena felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, judgment and doubt evident in expressions that had, only moments before, seemed friendly and welcoming. She searched desperately for Alistair among the crowd, but he was nowhere in sight, having been drawn away earlier by matters requiring his attention as host. The humiliation of the moment overwhelmed her, and Elena felt tears threatening, despite her fierce determination not to let Celeste see how deeply the accusation had wounded her. She turned abruptly, pushing through the crowd toward the ballroom's exit, desperate to escape the weight of so many judging eyes, before her composure crumbled entirely. She made her way through the manor's corridors blindly, tears finally spilling over once she was certain no one could see her, and found herself in the same garden where Alistair had first kissed her, the memory now tinged with painful irony, given the circumstances that had just unfolded. She sank onto the familiar stone bench, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold night air, her mind spinning with humiliation and doubt. Had Celeste's words carried some truth that others could see more clearly than Elena herself? She loved Alistair, of that she remained certain, but would others ever truly believe her feelings were genuine, given the vast difference in their circumstances? The thought that her family's financial struggles might forever taint how others perceived her love for him filled her with a despair she had not anticipated. She did not know how long she sat there, lost in her spiraling thoughts, before she heard footsteps approaching along the garden path. She quickly wiped at her tears, expecting perhaps a servant sent to find her, but instead found Alistair himself, his expression a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. "Elena," he said, rushing toward her. "I heard what happened in the ballroom. Are you all right?" Elena could not quite bring herself to meet his eyes, the weight of Celeste's accusations still pressing heavily upon her. "I should not have left so abruptly," she said quietly. "It was foolish of me to run." "It was not foolish," Alistair said firmly, sitting beside her and taking her hands gently in his. "Celeste's cruelty was entirely unprovoked and unfair. I am the one who should apologize for not being present to defend you against such baseless accusations." "Are they baseless?" Elena asked, finally lifting her eyes to meet his, needing to voice the doubt that had been growing within her since Celeste's confrontation. "My family does carry significant debts, Alistair. Perhaps others are right to wonder whether that reality has influenced my feelings toward you, even if I do not consciously believe it myself." Alistair's expression softened with understanding, though frustration remained evident beneath the surface. "Elena, listen to me carefully. I do not care about your family's financial circumstances, nor do I believe for a single moment that such matters have influenced your genuine feelings for me. I have watched you fight fiercely to protect your father's legacy, watched you work with your own hands to maintain what remains of your estate, watched you refuse every opportunity to simply abandon your struggles for an easier path. A woman motivated purely by financial gain would never have shown such stubborn independence." His words offered some comfort, though the sting of public humiliation still lingered painfully within her. "I do not know how to face those guests again tonight," she admitted. "You do not have to," Alistair said gently. "Allow me to arrange for a carriage to take you home. I will address Celeste's accusations properly, and we will resolve this matter completely. I promise you that. But tonight, you deserve peace rather than further confrontation." Elena nodded, grateful for his understanding, though a part of her felt the sting of retreating, rather than standing her ground as she once had against him on that very first night. Alistair walked her to a waiting carriage, promising to visit her the following day, once he had properly addressed the situation, and Elena rode home through the darkness, with her heart heavy, despite his reassurances. She did not yet know that Alistair had every intention of setting things right immediately, nor did she anticipate exactly how far he would go to defend her honor and prove, beyond any doubt, the sincerity of his love for her. Elena barely slept that night, her mind replaying the humiliation of the ballroom over and over, Celeste's cruel words echoing alongside the doubtful expressions of the guests who had witnessed the entire exchange. By morning, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones, and she moved through her usual chores with a heaviness that Margaret noticed immediately. "You must not let that woman's cruelty consume you," Margaret said gently, setting a cup of tea in front of Elena at the kitchen table. "The Duke's feelings for you have never wavered, regardless of what accusations were thrown at the ball." "I know his feelings are genuine," Elena said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "But I fear the damage to his reputation may already be done. Perhaps it would be simpler for everyone if I stepped away from this relationship entirely, before things grow even more complicated." "Do you truly believe that would bring you happiness?" Margaret asked pointedly. Elena did not have an answer, her heart and her practical mind pulling in different directions. Before she could dwell further on the question, the sound of an approaching carriage drew her attention toward the window, and she watched with surprise as Alistair himself climbed down, his expression determined, carrying a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. She met him at the door, uncertain what to expect after the previous evening's events. "Alistair, I did not expect you so early." "I could not wait any longer," he said, his eyes searching her face with obvious concern. "I needed to see you, to make certain you were all right after everything that happened." Elena led him inside, and they settled into her small sitting room, considerably more modest than the grand rooms of Ravenscroft Manor, though Alistair seemed entirely unconcerned with the difference in surroundings. "I spent the remainder of last night investigating Celeste's accusations properly," Alistair explained, opening the leather folder he had carried with him. "I suspected there was more to her sudden hostility than simple concern over rumors, and I was correct." He produced several documents, spreading them carefully across the small table between them. "These are records showing Celeste's own financial circumstances following the end of her marriage. She left her husband amid significant scandal, and her current situation is far more desperate than anyone realized. It appears her return to the county, and her sudden interest in reclaiming a connection with me, stems entirely from her own need to secure financial stability. not from any genuine remaining affection. Elena studied the documents with growing understanding, seeing clearly now the true motivations behind Celeste's cruel accusations the previous evening. She accused me of exactly what she herself is guilty of, Elena said slowly, the realization settling heavily within her. Precisely, Alistair confirmed. I confronted her early this morning with this evidence, and she did not deny it. She hoped that by casting doubt on your intentions, she might drive a wedge between us, creating an opportunity to reposition herself as my intended companion once more. Why would she believe such a scheme could possibly succeed? Elena asked, still trying to process the depth of Celeste's deception. Desperation often leads people toward poor decisions, Alistair said, his expression softening as he reached for Elena's hands. But her scheme has failed entirely, Elena. I have made it abundantly clear to her that my feelings for you remain unwavering, and that her presence in this county, should she continue attempting to interfere in our relationship, will no longer be welcome at any gathering I host or attend. Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her, though lingering uncertainty about the public perception from the previous evening remained. But what of the guests who witnessed her accusations? They will still carry doubts about my intentions, regardless of the truth behind Celeste's own motivations. I intend to address that as well, Alistair said, his expression turning determined once more. Which brings me to the reason I came here so urgently this morning, beyond simply reassuring you of my continued devotion. He rose from his seat and knelt before her, and Elena's breath caught in her throat as she realized exactly what he intended to do. Elena Whitfield, I had planned to make this proposal properly last night, at the ball, before Celeste's interference disrupted everything. I do not wish to wait any longer to correct that disruption. He produced a small velvet box from within his coat, opening it to reveal a beautiful ring, simple yet elegant, clearly chosen with careful consideration rather than mere ostentatious display. I love you completely, Elena, Alistair continued, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident in his eyes. I have loved you since that very first night you confronted me with nothing but righteous fury and complete disregard for my title. You have shown me, time and again, the meaning of genuine courage and honest affection, qualities I had begun to believe were impossible to find in someone drawn toward my position and wealth. I do not care what accusations Celeste or anyone else throws our way. I want to build a life with you, properly and publicly, as my wife. Will you marry me? Tears filled Elena's eyes as the weight of his words settled over her, washing away the lingering doubts and humiliation from the previous evening. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Alistair, I will marry you. He rose immediately, pulling her into a joyful embrace, and Elena laughed through her tears as he spun her gently around the small sitting room, both of them overwhelmed with happiness, despite the challenges that had led them to this moment. I intend to make our engagement known publicly and immediately, Alistair said once they had settled, still holding her close. I will personally address the accusations from last night, presenting the truth about Celeste's own circumstances, to anyone who continues to harbor doubts about your genuine affection for me. I will not allow her cruelty to cast even the slightest shadow over our future together. Thank you, Elena said softly, still marveling at the ring now resting on her finger, catching the morning light streaming through the window, for believing in me so completely, even when I struggled to fully believe in myself last night. I will always believe in you, Elena, Alistair said, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. You have given me more genuine happiness in these past months than I experienced throughout my entire life before meeting you. I intend to spend the rest of my days ensuring you feel as cherished and secure as you deserve. They spent the remainder of the morning together, discussing plans for how best to address the previous evening's events and announce their engagement properly to the county. Alistair insisted on hosting a follow-up gathering specifically to clarify the truth about Celeste's accusations and to formally introduce Elena as his future wife, determined to ensure no lingering doubt remained about the genuine nature of their love. As Elena watched him prepare to leave, his expression still soft with lingering happiness from their engagement, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for how completely their relationship had transformed from that chaotic first encounter months before. What had begun with anger and misunderstanding in the middle of the night had blossomed into something she had never expected to find again after losing her father, a genuine partnership built on honesty, mutual respect, and deep affection. "I love you, Alistair," she said as he prepared to depart, the words feeling natural and easy after everything they had shared together. "I love you as well, Elena," he replied, pressing one final gentle kiss to her lips before climbing into his waiting carriage. "Our future together begins now, and I intend to make certain it is nothing short of extraordinary." Elena watched his carriage disappear down the road, her heart lighter than it had felt in years, the ring on her finger a tangible reminder that genuine happiness, however unexpected, had finally found its way into her life. News of the engagement spread through the county faster than any gossip that had come before it, and true to his word, Alistair hosted a gathering the following week, specifically to address the accusations from the ball, and to formally announce his intention to marry Elena. He stood before the assembled guests with the same quiet confidence he had shown from their very first meeting, presenting the truth about Celeste's own financial desperation with calm, measured precision, leaving no room for doubt about the genuine motivations behind her earlier cruelty. Celeste herself did not attend, having quietly departed the county only days after her confrontation with Alistair, her scheme thoroughly exposed, and her welcome among the local aristocracy effectively ended. Elena felt no satisfaction in her rival's downfall, only relief that the truth had finally come to light, allowing her and Alistair to move forward without the shadow of doubt hanging over their happiness. The guests who had once whispered about Elena's intentions now offered genuine congratulations, many admitting privately that they had suspected Celeste's accusations carried an unpleasant edge of desperation rather than honest concern. Elena found herself gradually welcomed into society with a warmth she had not anticipated, her earlier courage and continued grace throughout the difficult ordeal, earning her genuine respect among people who had once regarded her with suspicion. The months leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation, filled with dress fittings, discussions about the ceremony, and the slow, steady process of Elena adjusting to her new role as the future Duchess of Ravenscroft. She insisted, despite Alistair's initial hesitation, on continuing to manage her family's estate personally, refusing to abandon the land her father had worked so hard to preserve, even as her responsibilities within the Ravenscroft household continued to grow. Alistair supported her decision fully, arranging for skilled workers to help modernize and strengthen her estate's operations, ensuring that her family's legacy would remain protected and prosperous for generations to come, entirely independent of any benefit that might come from their marriage. It was, Elena often reflected, exactly the kind of partnership she had never dared to hope for, one built on mutual respect and genuine support rather than mere obligation. As the wedding day approached, Elena made a request that surprised many among the household staff and guests alike. Rather than holding the entire ceremony within the grand halls of Ravenscroft Manor, she asked that a portion of the celebration take place on her own family's land, specifically near the old oak trees that had witnessed the very beginning of her relationship with Alistair, the same field where she had once confronted him in her robe, hair wild and undone, demanding justice for the trespass upon her land. Alistair agreed immediately, delighted by the sentiment behind her request, and arrangements were made to hold a portion of the wedding celebration outdoors, near the historic boundary, weather permitting, before the formal reception continued within the manor itself. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, spring finally settling fully over the county, with blooming flowers and gentle warmth that seemed almost designed specifically for the occasion. Elena dressed carefully, her gown a beautiful cream color, adorned with delicate embroidery, her hair styled elegantly, rather than left wild, as it had been during their first encounter, though she could not help smiling at the memory as Margaret helped fasten the final pins. "You look absolutely radiant, Miss Whitfield," Margaret said, her eyes shining with emotion as she stepped back to admire her handiwork. "Your father would be so proud of the woman you have become." "Thank you, Margaret," Elena said, embracing the woman who had become far more than simply her housekeeper over the years, a genuine friend and confidant who had supported her through every difficulty since her father's passing. "I could not have reached this day without your constant support." The ceremony itself took place near the old oak trees, exactly as Elena had requested, with guests gathered beneath the spreading branches, while soft music drifted through the air. Elena walked toward Alistair with her heart full of joy, remembering vividly the chaos and anger of their first meeting in this very field, marveling at how completely their relationship had transformed since that unexpected midnight confrontation. Alistair waited for her with an expression of pure adoration, his eyes glistening with emotion as she approached, and when she finally reached him, he took her hands gently in his, both of them smiling despite the formal solemnity the occasion typically demanded. "I still remember exactly how you looked that first night," he whispered, as the ceremony began, too quiet for anyone else to hear. "Standing right here, hair wild and untamed, absolutely fearless in your fury. I fell in love with you before I even fully understood what was happening. And I remember thinking you were the most arrogant man I had ever encountered," Elena whispered back, unable to suppress a small laugh despite the formal setting. "I suppose I was, in some respects," Alistair admitted with a warm smile. "Though I like to believe you have taught me a great deal since then, about genuine humility and honest connection." The ceremony proceeded beautifully, and when Alistair finally kissed his new bride before the assembled guests, cheers erupted throughout the field, birds scattering from the old oak trees at the sudden burst of noise and celebration. Elena felt tears of pure joy sliding down her cheeks as she embraced her new husband, surrounded by the very land that had brought them together in such unexpected circumstances months before. The reception that followed at Ravenscroft Manor stretched long into the evening, filled with dancing, laughter, and genuine warmth from guests who had come to witness not merely the marriage of a duke, but the culmination of a love story that had captured the imagination of the entire county. Even those who had once doubted the sincerity of Elena's affections now offered their heartfelt congratulations, having witnessed firsthand the genuine devotion between the newly married couple throughout the months leading to this celebration. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Alistair led Elena out onto the same terrace where they had shared their first meaningful conversation months before, the moonlight casting a soft glow over the gardens below. "Are you happy, Elena?" Alistair asked softly, pulling her close against him, as they looked out over the peaceful grounds together. "More than I ever believed possible," Elena replied honestly, resting her head against his shoulder. "I never expected to find this kind of happiness again after losing my father, and certainly never expected to find it with a duke I once threatened to report to the constable." Alistair laughed warmly at the memory, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Life has a curious way of bringing exactly what we need, even when we least expect it. I am endlessly grateful that fate chose that particular night for your trees to be threatened, however chaotic and unconventional our beginning may have been." "As am I," Elena agreed, smiling up at her husband with complete contentment, wild hair, robe and all. They stood together on the terrace for a long while, content simply to enjoy each other's company, as the celebration continued softly behind them, both aware that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, exactly as Alistair had promised during that very first difficult period of their courtship. Their unconventional beginning had led them to a genuine, lasting love, one built not on titles or expectations, but on honesty, courage, and the simple, unshakable recognition of two people who truly understood and cherished one another. As the last guests finally departed and the manor grew quiet around them, Elena allowed herself a final moment of reflection on the journey that had brought her to this point. From a lonely young woman struggling to preserve her father's legacy, to a confident duchess standing beside a man who loved her completely, exactly as she was. Whatever society may have once whispered about their unusual courtship, nothing could diminish the genuine happiness that had blossomed between them, proof that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most extraordinary endings.